what I really like is for people to ask questions, and everyone smiles encouragingly and says nothing. I give everyone the choice. Do you want to ask questions or do you want to listen? And they just smile. I can talk for 50 minutes, but I'd much rather answer your questions. We don't need many questions. But if you ask questions, it gives you the illusion of being in control, rather than me just sitting here talking. Does anyone want to ask a question? Here we go again. Nobody wants to ask a question. All right. Shall I start? And then if you object to anything, want to ask a question, put up your hand, throw something, call out. We'll stop and deal with it. And do feel entitled to argue. Remember, I write fiction. This is only my opinions. One thing writers never talk to each other about is how they write. Most of my friends are writers, poets, script writers, novelists. We read each other's books. We even buy each other's books. We will talk about the books. What we do not care is how they were written. We spend our lives finding the way that suits us, and it is of no interest to anyone else. So anything I say about writing applies to me. There are no rules. This is just the way I do it. But principally, I have to say, I write for a living. It is the day job. And although most of the time I write exactly what I like, I don't write bestsellers. I don't expect anything I write to be a bestseller. Nothing ever has been. I'm not likely to start now. But I've never written a book I didn't want to. I can usually persuade my publishers to let me do more or less what I like. But sometimes I have great difficulty persuading a publisher that a book will be of any interest. And Stratford Boys was one of them. It wasn't so much that they didn't think anyone would be interested, but I could tell that they thought it would be desperately dull, because it's about Shakespeare. Now, this is a terrible thing, especially from English publishers. But they thought it would be academic. And one of the reasons it has the cover it's got is because the illustrations for the jacket were also desperately dull and academic. It looked like a textbook. And in the end, I persuaded them to use a cartoonist, so that no one looking at it could possibly think it was going to be serious. Now, of course, it is serious. I have got something to say in this book. That's why I wrote it. But it's also a comedy. I wanted people to see that before they started reading. And anyway, I didn't particularly want to write about Shakespeare. What I was interested in was the characters in one of his plays. Now, the great Shakespearean scholar, Samuel Schoenbaum, who was an American, probably knew more about Shakespeare and his life and his times than anyone else. And he wrote many very entertaining books about him. And he said, it's dangerous to read Shakespeare's plays as, this is a French term, which you'll probably recognise, pièces à clé, keys to his life. You can't see Shakespeare in his plays. He gives nothing away. If you read them all very, very carefully many times, you begin to get some idea of his philosophy, of his outlook. But you don't find him in the plays. And people say, oh, he must have been a soldier. He is so good at soldiers. He must have been an aristocrat. He is so good at aristocrats. No one ever says he must have been a woman. He's so good at women. But the point is, he was good at people. He was a writer. That was his job. All fiction really is about people. And most of the time, I agree absolutely with Schoenbaum. You don't look for hints about Shakespeare and his friends in the plays. But just occasionally, you think he must have based that character on someone real. He must have known these people. You can't make that kind of thing up. Does anyone know Romeo and Juliet? It's hard to miss. Mercutio, the friend. He has to die. He dies halfway through. He has to die. He is taking over the play. He's the most interesting person in it. He's got all the best lines. He's got to go, or it's going to end up a completely different story. And, he is, after all, meant to die. If he were not killed by Tybalt, Romeo would not kill Tybalt himself, and the story would come out. It might even have a happy ending. But Mercutio is taking over because of the way he talks. And that's what he does. He talks. Once he gets started, he's almost impossible to stop. Every time he opens his mouth, the others try to shut him up. And if they don't manage it, he goes on talking. There is a word for this. It is a pathological condition. It's called logorrhea. Logorrhea. It's probably a much more simplified spelling these days. The Americans have been at it. But logorrhea, it's like diarrhea. The words pour out. And that's Mercutio. Now, I can't believe he made him up. There must have been people around who suffered from logorrhea in the 16th century, just as there are now. If you've ever been caught by one, you'll remember what it's like. They cannot stop. It becomes quite painful to watch because you can't answer them. You can't break in. It's just this unstoppable torrent of words. And it's nervous. It's very upsetting. And, I'm sure he encountered it. But that wasn't what set me off writing Stratford Boys. What I was interested in is where he got the workman in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, I love this play. I know it well. It is the play in England to which children are introduced to Shakespeare through, because it has fairies in it, and it has funny workmen. It's not actually about fairies. It's about two things specifically. It is about illusion, and it's about sex. Getting it. Not getting it with the wrong people. There is a running joke about bestiality. Bottom doesn't just have ass's ears. And this is considered suitable for small children. There is a sexual standoff between Oberon and Titania, the king and the queen of the fairies. It's been going on so long it has affected the weather. Shakespeare was writing about a real summer when he wrote that play. Terrible rain, rather like this summer. Ruined crops, fields knee-deep in mud. This really happened, though it probably wasn't anything to do with anyone's marital problems. But, this is one side of the story, very, very earthy. The workmen, ordinary people. And then there's the other side, illusion. Seeing what is not there, being made to see what other people want you to see, being deceived and manipulated, and being willing to be deceived. Because when you go to the theatre, I'm not talking about movies, television, video, these try and look real. But when you go to the theatre, you know you are sitting on a seat, in your case, in Belgium, listening to actors perhaps speaking Dutch, and yet you allow yourself to believe that you are seeing a foreign country, people speaking a foreign language, thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, in the future. You know it is not true, but you believe the illusion. That is why you go to the theatre. And it was the same in Shakespeare's time. Theatres were even less realistic. Most people, when they went to the theatre in the countryside, in a town like Torut, there are plenty of towns like Torut in England, Stratford would have been one of them. Players would come from London. If there was plague in London, the theatres closed and the actors went on the road. They didn't like doing it. It was very uncomfortable. But they did. That was the only way to earn a living. They would go to the theatre. It would be a row of barrels outside an inn with boards laid across them. Maybe a curtain. They would not, most of them, wear costumes. Nothing very fancy anyway. No scenery. All they had really were their voices. And people would stand in the yard of the inn and they would believe what they were seeing. Kings, princes, great battles, angels, God. And in A Midsummer Night's Dream, we have a group of workmen who want to put on a play. Now, every production I think I have seen of A Midsummer Night's Dream is ruined by the way the workmen are played as half-wits. They are so stupid, their knuckles are dragging on the ground, almost. They can barely speak. And one exception, I don't know if you've seen it, there's actually a Hollywood movie of A Midsummer Night's Dream with Kevin Kline playing Bottom and Roger Rees as Quince and Stanley Tucci as Puck. You know, fine stage actors. And it works very well. But nearly all productions show the workmen as half-wits. And I hate that, because this isn't how they're written. Shakespeare himself is not laughing at them. The fairies laugh at them, but then they laugh at everybody. They call them hempen homespuns. They're being rude about their clothes. Rude mechanicals, people who work with their hands. The aristocrats sneer at them. Oh, these are men who, hard-handed sons of toil. They work in the market. Actually, none of this is true. Shakespeare always writes of them, enter Quince, enter Bottom, enter Snug, enter Starveling, by name. He only calls them collectively once, and that is right at the end. He says, exeunt, that means they go out, exeunt the handicraftsmen. Now this is what they are craftsmen. One is a weaver, one is a carpenter, one is a tailor, one is a joiner. Now this is precision woodwork. This is not for idiots. The other two have ordinary jobs, but there are, 4 craftsmen there. Intelligent people. And I could never understand, why are they always shown as stupid? Their play is rubbish. They are rubbish actors. But they are not stupid. And I read the play again very, very carefully. Once I knew I was going to write this book. I'd actually been paid in advance. And started working on it. I read the play very carefully. And I finally homed in on one line where Quince is giving out the parts. You're going to be Pyramus, the hero. You're going to be Thisbe, she's the heroine. You're going to be the lion. The guy who is going to play the lion is Snug, the joiner. All right? And he says to Quince, if you've got my part written down, let me have it now, because I am slow of study. Now, this is a theatrical term. It means exactly the same now as it did in 1600. Actors still use it. If you are slow of study, it takes you a long time to learn your lines. Many great actors are famously slow to learn their lines. They have them written up at the back of the scenery. A quick study, someone who learns the lines fast. That's all it means. But everyone seems to think because he is slow of study, he must be slow. But he isn't. Remember, they've only got 4 days to do this play. Theseus says that in the first line. He's in a hurry. It's going to take him a long time to learn his lines. He wants them now. That isn't the joke. The joke is the next line. When Quince says to him, well, your part isn't written down. You can make it up as you go along. It's nothing but roaring. He's going to be the lion. And the whole of that exchange seems to have made people think that all these people are very, very stupid. I don't think that's why Shakespeare wanted them in the play at all, to make fun of them. He doesn't make fun of them. What he wants to show is why their play doesn't work. Why the illusion doesn't work. And the reason is because they take everything absolutely literally. They've all seen plays. They love the idea of plays. They just can't believe that when they do it, anyone will believe the illusion. And there's a place in Act 3 where somebody, while they're rehearsing, says, what are we going to do for moonshine? Is the moon shining that night? And they rush off and get a calendar to see if the moon will shine. No, there won't be. Oh, well, it doesn't matter whether the moon shines or not. We'll be indoors. We'll have to leave the window open. You know, and then somebody, in the end, comes up with the idea of having a man with a lantern on a pole and a sign saying moon, right? Just in case people don't understand. Now, that's Act 3, but at the beginning of Act 2, Shakespeare has Oberon walk in, and he says, ill met by moonlight, proud Titania. And there's the moon. You have only to say moonlight and everyone can see the moon. And this is the comment he's making. They cannot believe in their own illusion. But he writes about them with huge affection. He's very specific about the mistakes they make, which is what makes me think that he actually knew them. He knew people who acted like that. Now, you know, he was a professional writer. He was also a professional actor, but probably not a very good one. But once he started writing, he was very successful. He was attached to the most successful acting company in England, in London. He would never have seen acting like Quince and Bottom and Snug on the London stage. So where did he see it? Really where the book came from. I have no proof, I might be completely wrong, but I think that this is what he was used to seeing at home in Stratford. For years, 150 years, 200 years, people have tried to prove that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. That the plays were written by somebody else pretending to be Shakespeare. The Earl of Southampton, somebody thought it was Queen Elizabeth, somebody thought it was Christopher Marlowe, someone else thought it was Francis Bacon. At the time, everyone assumed that Shakespeare was writing Shakespeare's plays. It was only later they began to think, how could he? He was nobody. He was nobody from nowhere. He didn't have a university education. He was a glover's son, someone who made gloves. From the back of beyond, from Stratford, this no-account town. How could he possibly have become the world's greatest playwright? He must have been an educated aristocrat. Well, of course he was educated. In those days, we're talking about the end of the 16th century. And this is true of all Europe. If you went to university, you trained for a profession. And there were only 3. the church, the law, and medicine. If you were doing medicine, you'd go to somewhere like Padua, Genoa. If it was theology, it would probably be Württemberg, where Hamlet went. Or Oxford, if you were English. But university wasn't an excuse to leave home. And he didn't go. On the other hand, he had as good an education as anyone in England would have got at a grammar school, the local grammar school. As his father was on the council, he would have been educated for nothing, for free, in the local grammar school. So it was no need to laugh at his lack of a university education. He wouldn't actually have learned any more by going there. But somehow people have got it into their heads. He was no one. How could he have become right? Well, the answer is that most writers start off as no one in particular. Great statesmen, generals, aristocrats, royalty are usually too busy doing something else to write. In fact, I was talking to a group at school this morning. I myself didn't go to university. I would never try and put anyone off going to university. But if you want to be a writer, for God's sake, go out and get a proper job and meet real people walking about and talking. Because people who go to university write books about people who go to university. Shakespeare is not particularly complimentary about educated people in his plays. In fact, he's quite rude about teachers. One gets the impression he didn't enjoy school much himself. But it's highly likely that he was a glover's son from Stratford, who had a proper job. He probably made gloves like his father, and finally got into acting, got into the theatre, became a writer, because he was so good at people. He understood people. If you read Shakespeare, even if you're English, when you first look at his plays, they look daunting. They seem to be written in another language. But once you get acquainted with him, you realise, yes, people still talk like this, and people still behave like this. Shakespeare could never have written Lord of the Rings. You know about Lord of the Rings, right? He could never have written a fantasy, a quest, because he knew how ridiculous people are. I write science fiction, but I never write fantasy. And one of the things I hate about fantasy is that in these wonderful worlds in the future, in strange new countries, ruled by magic, always ruled by magic, no one is ever silly. No one is ever ridiculous. No one ever makes a fool of himself. They're either pure evil or noble, upright, heroic. No one is ever daft or ridiculous. And of course people are. That is what makes them human. And that is what he loved about people. And you can see his love for people coming through his writing, and especially his workmen and their terrible play. I think he saw this kind of thing at home, because even in the 16th century, people put on plays for their own entertainment, what we call now am-dram, amateur dramatics. You know, if there was no plague in London, there would be no travelling company. In 1580, when this book is set, there was no plague in the spring. There was no travelling company in Stratford in April and May that year. 2 years later, in 1882, one of Shakespeare's in-laws, one of the Hathaway clan, was paid 13 and fourpence halfpenny. How much would that be? 50 pence. About €1, I suppose, for putting on a Whitsun entertainment, a pastime at Whitsun. And what I imagined in this book is that it's 1580, Shakespeare is 16, we have no idea what he was doing. I've got him in Stratford working for his father. There is going to be no travelling company. It's just past Easter, Whitsun, Pentecost is coming up. The town council would like to put on something to cheer people up. The country was in recession, especially the rural areas. People would have needed cheering up. 1580 was the year the last mystery plays were produced in England. Now, they went on in Europe, on the continent, because Europe continued to be Catholic. But of course, England under Henry VIII had broken away from the Catholic Church. Then it had become Protestant, then it had become Catholic, Protestant. Nobody knew what to think. But the mystery plays were of the Catholic Church. They were put on in the summer at the Feast of Corpus Christi. Now, Corpus Christi has no roots in the Bible. It does not celebrate anything in the liturgy. It was an invented feast ritual. In the middle of the summer, so the weather would be nice, good time for having a party. It marked the end of the cycle of Christ's sacrifice. It was after the Ascension. But it had no foundation in the Bible. And because the plays were associated with Corpus Christi, the Protestant Church suppressed them. It didn't ban them, it was much too clever. It would call the playbooks in every year and fiddle with them, rewrite them, and then they give them back too late for anyone to do anything about it. Very modern, really. And in the end, the workmen, the guildsmen, just gave up. And the last plays put on in Coventry, which is very near Stratford, were in 1580, or the year before, 1579, we don't know. But they were over. And what I have is Shakespeare and his friends, teenagers, with a very old copy of a mystery play. The mice have eaten most of it. They've eaten God. And the idea is that perhaps he can patch it. That's what they called it then. He can adapt it, make it usable again. And once he gets to work on it, he realises he can't rewrite it. He will have to write a new one. Now, I wanted to use a real mystery play as the basis for the story. And I chose one that was performed in Chester by the Glovers. And it was called Mactatio Abel, the slaying of Abel. This was pure luck. I didn't realise at the time, but the story of Cain and Abel is the one that Shakespeare refers to more than any other. 34 times, I think, in his 39 plays. It made a great impression on him, and his plays are full of brothers betraying brothers. So it was a good choice, but it was luck. And he rewrites this play. His friend Adrian has the job of getting the cast together and acting it. He had a problem. Half his cast are workmen. Half of them can't read. It was a great pleasure to make the hero, really, the one who was completely illiterate, end up as the best actor. And of course, people who are illiterate do have phenomenal memories. When we look now at the huge quantity of material that people in the Middle Ages could remember, you have to bear in mind that they couldn't read them. They had to remember them. The great ballads, from Beowulf onwards, these were passed down orally from people who could not read to people who could not read. They had no choice. They had to remember. And this is something which has atrophied. We are losing. The more literate we become, the less we rely on our memories. And everything now is on the internet. All you've got to do is press a button, type in Google. Hang on to your memories. But half of his actors are people like this. The other half are schoolboys who do not in the least want to play women. They're only asked to be in it because their voices have not broken. I mean, one of them is 6 feet tall. The other one looks like an all-in wrestler. But their voices haven't broken. And they don't much want to be women. If you know, in Midsummer Night's Dream, Francis Flute, who gets the part of Thisbe, says, "Nay, let me not play a woman. I have a beard coming," frantically scrabbling for bristles. Remember, too, that in those days, well, until the 19th century, little boys were dressed in skirts. It was a great day for a little lad when he was breeched, when he first went into hose or into trousers. It wouldn't have been so very long since they had been wearing skirts. You can see this problem in all plays of the period. Shakespeare, Webster, all those guys. There are very few women's parts because there were very few actors who could play women. And in an awful lot of the plays, the first thing the women do is dress up as men, which has led to a very odd facet of English male character. Englishmen will dress up as women at the least excuse. I'm not talking about transvestites, who try to pass as women. I'm talking about dressing up in women's clothes. Englishmen do it. I don't know why. In fact, a couple of us were, discussing this the other night after a conference. We came to the conclusion that it probably dates back to the Middle Ages and, until the 17th century. Women were not allowed to act in public. It was Charles II, who was very fond of women, who decided they ought to be acting on stage. That's where he picked up his mistresses. But up till that point, women were not allowed to act in public. The parts had to be played by men. Right back, to the mystery plays. Now, in Europe, in mainland Europe, I don't believe this was the case. I know in France, women probably did act in the mystery plays. There was never this terror of seeing them on stage. But we've had this tradition, for centuries, of dressing up as women. Any excuse, your average English bloke will put on false breasts and a skirt and be photographed. This isn't something they do quietly, shamefully in corners. They go out in the main street and do it. Very weird. But of course, at the time, professional actors didn't mind playing women. It was their job. They were being paid. But guys like my workman and his workman wouldn't have been nearly so keen. So, I was relying on things like this, things I was getting out of the plays and that I could verify in histories, books of the period, to build up a picture of what it might have been like at the time. This is based on a theory, but it is meant to be entertainment. And I had to wait so long to write it. I really did enjoy writing it. I hope some of that came through, actually. Right, anybody thought of a question yet? Hooray, hello.
This is a children's book, right? But you use a lot of different words. We all had a glossary with explanations with... Does it have a meaning?
Why, I like to make children suffer. No, it's not really a children's book. I reckon that once you get to about 12, if you're going to be a reader, you'll read anything. I mean, I did. I'd read everything in the children's library when I was 12. I went next door. When I was a kid, there were no teenage novels. There were no young adult novels. If you wanted to go on reading, you just read anything you could get your hands on. And I suppose if I'm addressing any reader in particular, it is someone like that who simply wants to read, who won't be put off by not knowing the words. I mean, you were studying it, but most I think most people reading in their own language learn by context. Do you know what I mean? They work out what the word means by the way it's being used. This is something Americans can't do. You had a glossary. I have had to write glossaries for my children's books when they're published in America, because Americans can't work out what biscuits are. They're terrified, that they'll be exposed to foreign ideas. It was Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright, who said the English and the Americans are two nations divided by a common language. But no, I will use any word I think is the right word. I will never look for anything simpler. If this is the word I want, I'll use it. And to hell with whether people understand it or not. It isn't just for children. I did have my perfectly serious theory to explore. If I'd written it for adults, I'd probably have had to have put a lot of gratuitous sex in, to please the publisher. And, I don't mind gratuitous sex, but I didn't really feel it had much to do with the story. No, I'm sorry if the words tripped you up, but I love words. That's really why I write. I am not a natural storyteller. People used to say, oh, your children must be so lucky, the stories you tell them at bedtime. No, I used to read them stories at bedtime, written by other people. I have got no talent for making up stories and telling them. I have to write them down. And I've had to learn to be a storyteller because I can't expect the general public to pay to watch me having a good time. People want a story. Doesn't matter what else you slip them, but they want a story. That's what they're paying for. They are giving up their valuable time to read your story. But what keeps me interested, yes, is working out an idea. I learn a huge amount when I write a book. I was explaining this to another group. This is how I'm paying for my education in a way. When I start a book, I will have an idea and I will know a certain amount. I expect to know 10 times more by the time I've finished. This is what I enjoy. I am learning all the time. And so long as I give people their story, I think after that I can enjoy myself in any way I want. And I just love language. That's why I write. Sorry about the glossary. Anyone else?
As a reader, we all have our favorite book, but do you also have a book that you liked writing the most?
I've got several. Now, this does not mean I look at the bookshelf every morning sitting there thinking, God, you're brilliant. I'm actually slightly appalled when I see how many I've written. But the favourites are the ones I've had the most fun writing. Remember, it is my job. I have never simply written for money. I have always enjoyed what I wrote. But very often I have to sign a contract 3 years before it's time to write the book. Although I don't write bestsellers, I don't bring in vast amounts of money for my publishers. I am very reliable. I meet my deadlines. I will never write anything so bad they can't publish it. This is experience. And so they're happy to sign me up in advance. They know that when the time comes, the book will be written. They'll be able to put it on the printing schedule before I've started it, because I will finish it. And sometimes when I'm ready to begin, I have gone right off the idea. But they've paid me for this book. I must write the book I said I would. Well, I suppose I could be a prima donna and say, no, I'm prostituting my art. But it's a job and I do it. I do it as well as I can. And part of that is producing what I said I would produce. And I will write that book as well as I can. No one must ever be able to see that I didn't want to write it. That I took the money and ran. And, you know, I do a decent job. I have won awards with books like that. But they are never my favourites. I didn't hate writing them, but there was no fun in it. This was fun. A very long book I wrote about 5 years ago called The Eclipse of the Century, science fiction. Again, I had to look for a publisher who would commission it. Nobody thought it would work. And it did. I had a wonderful time writing it. I had a very, very good editor on it. And that will always be a favourite. And, a very short one. It was a collection of short stories about 3 friends called Nazza, Nina and Morris. They first turned up in Feet. They were sitting at a table in the canteen at break, talking. They were about 17, first year, 6th. And Morris was explaining to the other 2 why he hadn't met them at the disco last night. And he'd gone down to the station to get his train, and he got on the wrong train, and this endless, involved explanation became the story. He'd spotted this girl he liked the look of, so he chatted her up, and he didn't want to look a complete idiot by admitting he didn't know where he was going. So he waited till he found out where she was going, and then bought a ticket to the next station. Then he had to wait to come back again. And the first station, she gets on. It turns out she was on the wrong train as well. She liked the look of him, stayed on until she chatted him up. Yes, he thought it was funny. She didn't. She was hideously embarrassed, stormed off to the other end of the train, refused to speak to him, and that was the end of his romance, and that was why he didn't get to the disco last night. Told like that, it takes about 50 seconds. The way Morris tells it, with the other 2 making rude remarks and jokes and comments, it takes 20 minutes. And I never write sequels. I have never written about the same people twice. You know, when I write a book, that's it. No trilogies, no series, no quests. But a few years later, a friend of mine, an editor and writer, asked me to write a story with a sporting background. Now, I do not follow sport, apart from motor racing, and I didn't really think I could get a story out of Grand Prix. I said, no, I can't do a sporting story, Aidan. Oh, you'll think of something, he said. And I did. I remembered Nazza, Nina and Morris. And I got them out again, sat them in the canteen, drinking coffee, talking. This time it was Nazza explaining how he once conned 2 American students into believing that you played snooker with China eggs. Had to do a lot of research with 6 hard-boiled eggs and a gardening cane on the kitchen table. It is insanely difficult. If you get the egg right in the middle, it will roll, but don't use it as a cue ball. If you get it near the blunt end, it twirls, but if you get it just at the right spot at the other end, it rises up and spins. And, completely useless information. The kids thought I was mad when they came home. But then a couple of years later, I had to write a ghost story. Back I went to Nazza, Nina and Morris, and in the end I wrote a whole book about them. Took them right through 1 year at school. Still talking, every day in the canteen, having coffee, talking, exchanging useless information, and eventually a story would get out. And I took them right through to the following July. When did I publish this? 83? No, it must have been later than that. Oh no, it was 88 when I wrote when I finally wrote the whole book. First one was written in 83. I can't write about them now. They'd be pushing 40, I should think. But I was really fond of them. They were fun, and it's always going to be one of my favourite books. Enough is too much already. But it was never a very successful book. But I'm fond of it.